In the dusty plains of New Mexico, 1982, where the desert holds secrets older than memory and time sometimes seems to fold in on itself, one rancher's discovery of an impossible letter would unravel a mystery that connected two generations and proved that some promises transcend even death itself. This is the extraordinary true story of how a piece of mail delivered 27 years late would change everything a man thought he knew about his family's past. Before we dive into this mind-bending tale of mystery and family secrets, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you love stories that blur the line between coincidence and destiny. What you're about to discover will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fate. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Sangre de Cristo Mountains as Daniel Rodriguez guided his pickup truck down the gravel road that led to his mailbox. It was March 15th, 1982, and at 34 years old, Daniel had been running the family ranch for over a decade, ever since his father's death had left him sole heir to 15,000 acres of high desert grazing land. The Double R Ranch had been in the Rodriguez family for 3 generations, founded by Daniel's grandfather in 1923 when the land was still wild and unforgiving. Through drought, depression, and decades of hard work, the family had built a modest but successful cattle operation that provided a decent living and deep roots in the rugged landscape of northern New Mexico. Daniel pulled up to the weathered wooden mailbox that bore the faded letters D. Rodriguez and climbed out of his truck. The March wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of spring, though patches of snow still clung to the higher elevations of the surrounding mountains. Inside the mailbox were the usual items: bills from the feed store, a circular from the local equipment dealer, and a letter from his insurance company. But at the bottom of the pile was an envelope that made Daniel's blood run cold. The envelope was yellowed with age, its edges brittle and worn. The postmark was barely legible, but Daniel could make out the words Albuquerque, NM, and a date that seemed impossible, March 15th, 1955. 27 years ago to the day. But what truly shocked Daniel was the address written in faded blue ink. Mr. Daniel Eduardo Rodriguez, Double R Ranch, Tierra Amarilla, New Mexico. Daniel stared at the envelope with trembling hands. His full name, including his middle name that few people knew, written in careful script on a letter postmarked the year he was born. It was impossible, yet there it was, sitting in his mailbox like any other piece of mail. The return address was equally mysterious: E. Valdez, 1247 Central Avenue, Albuquerque, NM. Daniel didn't recognize the name or address, and the street number seemed to be written in a slightly different ink, as if it had been added later. With his heart pounding, Daniel carefully opened the envelope, mindful of its fragile condition. Inside was a single sheet of paper, also yellowed with age, covered in the same careful handwriting as the address. March 15th, 1955. Dear Daniel Eduardo Rodriguez, if you are reading this letter, then God has seen fit to deliver it to you at the right time. My name is Elena Valdez, and I knew your father, Miguel Rodriguez, many years ago before he married your mother. There are things about your family's history that you need to know, secrets that your father carried to his grave because he thought they were better left buried. But some truths have a way of surfacing when they are most needed. Your grandfather, Roberto Rodriguez, did not buy the land for your ranch with money saved from working cattle drives, as your family has always believed. The truth is more complicated and more remarkable than you could imagine. In 1923, your grandfather saved the life of a wealthy businessman from back east who was traveling through New Mexico. This man, whose name was Jonathan Whitmore, was being robbed by bandits when your grandfather happened upon them. Roberto scared off the thieves and nursed Mr. Whitmore back to health after he had been badly beaten. In gratitude, Mr. Whitmore gave your grandfather the deed to 15,000 acres of land that he had purchased as an investment but never intended to develop. He made only one request: that Roberto promised to keep the truth of how he acquired the land secret until a generation had passed, to protect both families from questions about the circumstances. Your father honored this promise, even when times were hard, and he might have benefited from revealing the full story. But now that your father has passed away, and you have proven yourself worthy of carrying on the family legacy, it is time for you to know the truth. There is more to this story, much more, but it cannot be safely told in a letter. If you wish to learn the rest, come to Albuquerque and find the place where this letter was written. Look for the house with blue shutters on a street that no longer exists under its old name. Some promises outlive the people who make them. Some debts can only be repaid across generations. With respect and hope for your understanding, Elena Valdez P.S. Your father was a good man who carried a heavy burden. Now that burden passes to you, but with it comes an opportunity to right an old wrong. Daniel read the letter 3 times, each reading raising more questions than it answered. The date was impossible, 1955, the year he was born, written to him by name before his parents had even chosen what to call him. The story about his grandfather seemed equally impossible. Everyone in the family knew that Roberto Rodriguez had worked and saved for years to buy the ranch land. But as Daniel thought about it, he realized he had only his father's word for that story. Roberto had died when Daniel was only 5 years old, too young to remember much about his grandfather, beyond a vague impression of a tall, quiet man who spoke more Spanish than English and seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Daniel's father, Miguel, had indeed been secretive about certain aspects of the family history. Whenever Daniel had asked questions about how exactly his grandfather had acquired such a large tract of valuable land on a cowboy's wages, Miguel had grown uncomfortable and changed the subject. And then there were the documents Daniel had found after his father's death, property deeds and legal papers that seemed unnecessarily complex for what should have been a straightforward land purchase. Daniel had assumed they were just the product of 1920s bureaucracy, but now he wondered if there had been more to the story. The postmark was the most troubling aspect of all. Daniel examined it carefully under a magnifying glass, looking for signs of forgery or alteration, but it appeared genuine. The paper showed every sign of having been written in 1955. The ink had faded in exactly the way 30-year-old ink should fade, and the paper had the texture and composition of mid-20th century stationery. But how could someone in 1955 have known his exact name, including the middle name his parents didn't choose until after he was born? How could they have known he would inherit the ranch and need to learn this information in 1982? Daniel spent the rest of the day in a state of distraction, going through the motions of his ranch work while his mind churned over the impossible letter. That evening, he called his cousin Maria, who lived in Santa Fe and was the family historian, keeper of old photographs and stories. "Maria, do you remember anything about how Grandpa Roberto really acquired the ranch land?" Daniel asked, after exchanging pleasantries. Maria was quiet for a moment. "That's an odd question, Danny. Why do you ask?" "I'm just trying to piece together some family history. I found some old documents that don't quite match what Dad told me about Grandpa saving money from cattle drives." "Well," Maria said slowly, "I remember my mother, your father's sister, mentioning once that there was some kind of mystery about the land purchase. She said Roberto never liked to talk about it, and that there were rumors in the family about him having some kind of benefactor." Daniel's pulse quickened. "What kind of rumors?" "Oh, you know how these old family stories get twisted over time. Something about Roberto helping someone important and being rewarded for it. But your father always insisted it was nonsense, that Roberto had earned every acre through honest work." After hanging up with Maria, Daniel sat in his kitchen staring at the mysterious letter spread out on the table before him. Every rational part of his mind told him it had to be some kind of elaborate hoax, but the evidence of his own eyes suggested something far more inexplicable. The letter mentioned looking for the house with blue shutters on a street that no longer exists under its old name. It was cryptic, but it was also specific enough to suggest that Elena Valdez, whoever she was, had expected Daniel to be able to find this place. As Daniel prepared for bed that night, he found himself thinking about his father's dying words. Miguel had been delirious with fever in his final days, but there had been moments of clarity when he seemed to be wrestling with something that troubled him deeply. "Danny," his father had whispered on the last day, gripping Daniel's hand with surprising strength. "There are things I should have told you about the family, about Roberto, about promises that need to be kept." At the time, Daniel had assumed his father was simply rambling, confused by illness and medication. But now, in light of the impossible letter, those words took on new significance. Daniel made a decision that would change his life forever. Tomorrow, he would drive to Albuquerque and try to solve the mystery of Elena Valdez and her 27-year-old letter. He had to know the truth about his family's past, no matter how strange or impossible that truth might be. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Daniel found himself wondering if some secrets were powerful enough to transcend time itself, and whether the letter in his kitchen was evidence of a mystery that defied all logical explanation. The answers he sought in Albuquerque would prove to be more extraordinary than he could possibly imagine. The search for truth. Daniel arrived in Albuquerque on a cloudy March morning, the mysterious letter carefully folded in his shirt pocket. The city had changed dramatically since 1955. What had once been a modest southwestern town was now a sprawling metropolis of over 300,000 people, with new subdivisions stretching in every direction across the high desert. His first stop was the main post office, where he hoped to find some explanation for how a letter mailed in 1955 could have been delivered 27 years later. The postal worker, a middle-aged woman named Janet Flores, listened to his story with growing amazement. "Sir, I've been working for the Postal Service for 18 years, and I've never heard of anything like this," she said, examining the envelope under a bright desk lamp. "This postmark looks genuine, and the cancellation marks are consistent with 1955 postal procedures. But there's no way a letter could sit in our system for 27 years and suddenly be delivered. Could it have been lost and then found recently?" Daniel asked. Janet shook her head. "Even if it had been lost in a sorting facility or stuck behind some equipment, it would show signs of more recent handling. This envelope looks like it's been aging continuously since 1955. Daniel left the post office more puzzled than ever. His next stop was the Albuquerque Public Library, where he hoped to research the address mentioned in the letter, 1247 Central Avenue. The librarian, an elderly man named Professor Robert Sandoval, was intrigued by Daniel's quest. "Central Avenue has been the main east-west thoroughfare through Albuquerque since the early 1900s, he explained, as they pored over old city directories and maps. "But the numbering system has changed several times over the decades." They spent 2 hours searching through historical records, trying to match the address from 1955 with current street numbers. Finally, Professor Sandoval found what they were looking for in a 1955 city directory. "Here it is," he said, pointing to a small entry, 1247 Central Avenue, 1955. According to this, it was a boarding house run by someone named E. Valdez. Daniel's heart raced. Elena Valdez, that matches the name on the letter. Professor Sandoval cross-referenced the address with modern street numbers. Based on the changes in the numbering system, that address would be approximately where 2847 Central Avenue is today. But I should warn you, that entire block was torn down in the 1960s for urban renewal. There's a shopping center there now. Despite this setback, Daniel drove to the location where 1247 Central Avenue had once stood. The shopping center was typical of 1960s architecture, low, sprawling buildings housing a grocery store, a pharmacy, and several smaller shops. There was no trace of the boarding house that had once occupied this spot. Disappointed but not defeated, Daniel decided to canvass the surrounding neighborhood, hoping to find someone who might remember the area as it had been in the 1950s. Most of the nearby houses were newer constructions, but he eventually found a small adobe home that looked like it might date back to the right period. The woman who answered the door was in her 70s, with silver hair and keen brown eyes. She introduced herself as Carmen Gutierrez and listened with growing interest as Daniel explained his search. "Elena Valdez," Carmen repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I remember her. She ran a boarding house right where that shopping center is now. Very mysterious woman. Kept to herself mostly, but she was kind to people who needed help." Daniel's pulse quickened. "Do you remember anything specific about her?" Carmen invited Daniel inside and served him coffee while she searched her memory. "Elena was unusual. She seemed to know things about people, things she shouldn't have been able to know. My mother used to say Elena had the gift, the ability to see things that hadn't happened yet." "Did you ever hear her mention the Rodriguez family, or anything about a ranch in northern New Mexico?" Carmen's eyes widened. "Rodriguez? Yes, now that you mention it. Elena used to get mail addressed to different names, as if she was expecting letters for people who didn't live there. And I remember her mentioning once that she had a message to deliver to someone, but she had to wait for the right time. What happened to her?" "That's the strange part," Carmen said, lowering her voice. "Elena disappeared in 1955, right around the middle of March. One day she was there, the next day the boarding house was empty. The landlord said she had paid 6 months' rent in advance and left a forwarding address, but when people tried to contact her, the address didn't exist." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Elena Valdez had disappeared around the same time she had written the letter, March 15th, 1955. Carmen continued, "But here's the really odd thing. About 10 years later, I was working as a secretary at the courthouse, and I came across some property records that mentioned Elena Valdez. According to the documents, she had purchased a small house somewhere in the foothills, but when investigators tried to locate the property, they couldn't find it." "What do you mean they couldn't find it?" "The address existed on paper, but there was no house at that location. Just empty desert. It was like she had vanished completely, along with any trace of where she might have gone." Daniel left Carmen's house with more questions than answers, but he was now convinced that Elena Valdez had been a real person with a genuine connection to his family. The letter might be impossible to explain, but it wasn't a hoax. His next stop was the New Mexico State Archives, where he hoped to find more information about the Jonathan Whitmore mentioned in Elena's letter. If the story about his grandfather saving a wealthy businessman was true, there might be some historical record of the incident. The archivist, a young woman named Lisa Hernandez, was fascinated by Daniel's quest. "Whitmore, that name does ring a bell," she said as she searched through digital databases. There were several prominent Whitmore families in the Southwest during the early 20th century. After an hour of searching, Lisa found what they were looking for. Here it is: Jonathan Whitmore, born 1889, died 1961. He was a real estate investor from Boston who made a fortune buying and selling land in the American Southwest during the 1920s boom. The file contained newspaper clippings and business records documenting Whitmore's investments in New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. Daniel scanned through the documents, looking for any mention of robbery, bandits, or Roberto Rodriguez. Then Lisa found something extraordinary. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a newspaper clipping from the Albuquerque Journal, dated March 20th, 1923. The headline read, "Boston businessman rescued from bandits by local rancher." Daniel read the brief article with growing amazement. "Mr. Jonathan Whitmore of Boston was rescued from bandits this week by Roberto Rodriguez, a local rancher from the Tierra Amarilla area. Mr. Whitmore was traveling to inspect potential investment properties when his party was attacked by masked men north of Santa Fe. Mr. Rodriguez happened upon the scene and drove off the attackers, possibly saving Mr. Whitmore's life. Mr. Whitmore, who suffered serious injuries in the attack, was treated by Mr. Rodriguez and his family until he was well enough to travel." In a statement to this newspaper, Mr. Whitmore expressed his profound gratitude to the Rodriguez family and said he planned to show his appreciation in a substantial way. Mr. Rodriguez could not be reached for comment. Daniel stared at the newspaper clipping, his hands trembling slightly. Elena Valdez had been telling the truth. His grandfather really had saved Jonathan Whitmore's life, and Whitmore had indeed repaid the favor substantially. But this confirmation of Elena's story only deepened the central mystery. How had she known in 1955 that Daniel would need this information in 1982? How had she known his exact name before he was even born? As Daniel prepared to leave the archives, Lisa made one final discovery. "Mr. Rodriguez, I found one more document that might interest you. It's a land deed transfer from 1923, showing Jonathan Whitmore transferring ownership of 15,000 acres in Rio Arriba County to Roberto Rodriguez." The deed confirmed everything Elena had written. Roberto had not purchased the land with saved wages, but had received it as a gift from the man whose life he had saved. But at the bottom of the deed, there was a handwritten note that made Daniel's blood run cold. "This deed is held in trust pending delivery of additional information to the Rodriguez family heir in March 1982. E. Valdez, witness." Elena Valdez had not only known about the land transfer in 1923, she had somehow known that the full truth would need to be revealed to Daniel Rodriguez in March 1982, 59 years in the future. As Daniel drove back to his hotel that evening, he found himself grappling with evidence that suggested Elena Valdez had possessed knowledge that defied all rational explanation. But he was now certain of one thing. She had been trying to help his family, and there was still more to the story that he needed to discover. The letter had mentioned looking for the house with blue shutters on a street that no longer exists under its old name. Daniel had found the street, but it no longer existed. Tomorrow, he would have to find another way to uncover the rest of Elena Valdez's impossible secret. The house with blue shutters. Daniel spent a restless night in his Albuquerque hotel room, his mind racing with questions about Elena Valdez and her seemingly impossible knowledge of future events. By dawn, he had formulated a new plan for finding the mysterious house with blue shutters. If Elena had disappeared from Central Avenue in 1955, but had somehow purchased property in the foothills, perhaps the clue about a street that no longer exists under its old name referred to a road that had been renamed rather than demolished. At the city planning office, Daniel met with Margaret Torres, a senior planner who had worked for the city for over 20 years. She listened to his story with professional interest, then pulled out a series of historical maps showing how Albuquerque's street names had changed over the decades. Urban renewal in the 1960s led to a lot of street name changes, Margaret explained, spreading the maps across her desk. Sometimes it was to eliminate duplicate names, sometimes to honor local leaders or create more attractive addresses for development. They spent the morning comparing maps from different eras, looking for streets in the foothills area that had been renamed since 1955. Daniel was beginning to lose hope when Margaret found something promising. "Here's an interesting one," she said, pointing to a map from 1955. This road was called Valdez Lane, named after one of the original Spanish land grant families. But in 1967, it was renamed Sunset Ridge Drive to make it more appealing to buyers in a new subdivision. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Valdez Lane, could that be connected to Elena Valdez? It's possible. The Valdez family were early settlers in this area, and street names often honored prominent local families. Margaret provided Daniel with the current address range for what had once been Valdez Lane, and he immediately drove out to investigate. Sunset Ridge Drive was now a well-developed suburban street, lined with modern homes. But at the far end, where the pavement gave way to dirt roads leading into the foothills, Daniel found something that stopped him in his tracks. There, set back from the road among a grove of ancient cottonwood trees, stood a small adobe house that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1950s. And hanging at its windows were faded blue wooden shutters. Daniel parked his truck and approached the house cautiously. It appeared to be abandoned. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and several windows were cracked. But the structure itself seemed sound, and there was something about the place that felt preserved rather than neglected, as if it had been waiting for someone to return. The front door was unlocked. Daniel pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out to announce his presence in case anyone was living there. The interior was dusty, but remarkably well preserved, furnished with simple but well-made furniture that looked like it dated from the 1950s. On a small table near the window sat a stack of papers, and Daniel's breath caught as he recognized the same careful handwriting from the letter he had received. The top sheet was addressed to him, "For Daniel Eduardo Rodriguez, when he finds this place." With trembling hands, Daniel picked up the papers and began to read. "If you are reading this, then you have followed the clues and found your way to the truth. I am Elena Valdez, and I have been waiting a very long time to tell you the rest of your family's story. I am not an ordinary woman, Daniel. I was born with what my grandmother called the gift of seeing, the ability to perceive events that have not yet happened. It is a burden as much as a blessing, for knowledge of the future comes with the responsibility to act upon it. In 1923, I saw in a vision that your grandfather Roberto would save the life of Jonathan Whitmore, and that this act of heroism would be repaid with a great gift of land. But I also saw that Roberto would keep the truth secret out of pride and fear, and that this secret would cause problems for his descendants. I saw you, Daniel, struggling to keep the ranch profitable in the 1980s, not knowing that you had additional resources available to you. The gift your grandfather received was not just the land, but also a trust fund established by Jonathan Whitmore to ensure the ranch's success for future generations. Mr. Whitmore set aside $50,000 in 1923, a fortune in those days, to be held in trust for the Rodriguez family. The money has been earning interest for nearly 60 years, managed by a bank in Denver that Mr. Whitmore specified in his will. By 1982, that $50,000 has grown to over $400,000. The bank has been trying to contact the Rodriguez family for years, but they have been looking for Roberto's descendants under the wrong name. When Roberto moved to New Mexico, he simplified his name from Roberto Rodriguez Valdez to Roberto Rodriguez, dropping the Valdez portion for reasons I cannot explain in a letter. I am the last of the Valdez line that was connected to your family, Daniel. Roberto was my distant cousin, and it fell to me to ensure that the Whitmore Trust eventually reached its rightful heirs. But the gift came with specific instructions. It could only be claimed by a Rodriguez heir who proved worthy through hard work and dedication to the land. You have proven yourself worthy, Daniel. For 11 years you have struggled to maintain the ranch through drought and economic hardship, never knowing that help was available. Mr. Whitmore's will specified that his gift should go to a Rodriguez, who demonstrated the same character and integrity that Roberto showed when he saved a stranger's life. Daniel had to stop reading and sit down. The implications of what Elena was telling him were staggering. Not only was there a substantial trust fund that belonged to his family, but Elena Valdez had somehow known about his financial struggles in the 1980s while writing this letter in the 1950s. He continued reading. The final papers you need are in the wooden chest under the window. There you will find the original trust documents, correspondence from the Denver Bank, and legal papers establishing your right to claim the inheritance. But Daniel, the money is not the most important gift I have for you. In the chest, you will also find letters from your grandfather to my family, written in the years before his death. These letters reveal the kind of man Roberto truly was, not just brave and honorable, but deeply thoughtful about the legacy he wanted to leave for his children and grandchildren. Roberto knew about my gift of seeing, and he asked me to watch over his family's future. I have done so to the best of my ability, but my time is ending. By the time you read this, I will have been gone for many years. The gift of seeing comes with the price of knowing when your own story will end. Take care of the land, Daniel. It was given to your family not just as payment for a debt, but as a trust for future generations. Use the resources now available to you wisely, and remember that true wealth lies not in money, but in the connections we forge with the people and places we love. The blood of both Rodriguez and Valdez flows in your veins, though you never knew it. You are the bridge between past and future, the keeper of promises made before you were born. With love and hopes for your family's continued prosperity, Elena Valdez, written in March 1955, for delivery in March 1982. Daniel sat in the dusty silence of Elena's abandoned house, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. The woman who had written his impossible letter had been family, a distant cousin who had used her inexplicable gift to watch over the Rodriguez line for decades. He opened the wooden chest Elena had mentioned and found everything she had promised. Legal documents establishing the Whitmore Trust, correspondence from a Denver bank trying to locate the Rodriguez heirs, and most precious of all, a collection of letters from his grandfather, Roberto. Reading Roberto's letters, Daniel finally understood the man his grandfather had been, thoughtful, proud, and deeply committed to building something lasting for his children. Roberto had indeed known about Elena's gift and had trusted her to ensure that the family's true legacy would be preserved. But perhaps most importantly, Daniel found a letter Roberto had written specifically for him, somehow knowing that his grandson would one day need guidance and encouragement. To my grandson Daniel, who will carry on our name, if you are reading this, then Elena has successfully delivered the truth about our family's blessing. I want you to know that everything we have, the land, the animals, the buildings, came to us through an act of simple human decency. I helped a stranger because it was the right thing to do, never expecting any reward. The reward came anyway, as rewards sometimes do, when we act from the heart rather than from calculation. But with great gifts come great responsibilities. The land is not truly ours to own. We are its caretakers, holding it in trust for those who will come after us. Be proud of your heritage, Daniel, but remember that true nobility comes from our actions, not our possessions. The Whitmore Trust will give you security, but your character will determine what you do with that security. I hope that when your time comes to pass on the family legacy, you will be able to say that you left the land better than you found it, and that you treated all people with the same kindness that was shown to me. Your grandfather, who loves you across the years, Roberto Rodriguez Valdez. As Daniel prepared to leave Elena's house, he realized that he had found much more than money or property deeds. He had found his true family history, a story of heroism, gratitude, sacrifice, and the mysterious power of human connection across time. The impossible letter had led him to an impossible house, where a woman with an impossible gift had preserved the truth until the moment when he needed it most. Now, it was up to Daniel to honor that trust and build on the foundation his ancestors had laid. The legacy fulfilled. 3 months later, Daniel stood on the front porch of his ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The envelope that had started his incredible journey sat framed on his mantelpiece, a reminder of how dramatically his life had changed since that March morning when he had discovered Elena Valdez's impossible letter. The Whitmore Trust had indeed been real, and with the help of a Denver attorney, Daniel had successfully claimed the inheritance that had been waiting for his family for nearly 60 years. The $400,000, along with accumulated interest and dividends, had provided him with the financial security to not just maintain the ranch, but to expand and improve it in ways his grandfather could never have imagined. But the money, as Elena had predicted, turned out to be far less important than the knowledge Daniel had gained about his family's true history. Understanding that his grandfather had been rewarded for an act of simple human kindness had fundamentally changed how Daniel viewed his responsibilities as a landowner and community member. The first thing Daniel did with his newfound resources was establish the Rodriguez Valdez Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to helping families in crisis throughout northern New Mexico. Inspired by his grandfather's example and Elena's mysterious gift, Daniel wanted to ensure that acts of kindness would continue to ripple forward through time. The foundation provided emergency assistance to ranching families facing drought or economic hardship, funded scholarships for local students, and supported preservation efforts for the region's historic sites and cultural traditions. Daniel also used part of the trust to purchase additional grazing land that was being threatened by development, ensuring that the area's ranching heritage would be preserved for future generations. But Daniel's most meaningful discovery was personal rather than financial. Among the papers Elena had left for him was a detailed family tree showing the connections between the Rodriguez and Valdez lines, along with contact information for relatives he had never known existed. Following up on this information, Daniel had connected with cousins in Colorado, Arizona, and California, descendants of other branches of the extended family who had stories of their own about Elena Valdez's mysterious interventions in their lives. It seemed that Elena had been watching over the entire family network, using her gift to help relatives in need across the decades. Maria Esperanza, a cousin living in Denver, told Daniel about receiving an anonymous scholarship to nursing school in 1968. A scholarship that she later learned had been funded by someone named E. Valdez. Carlos Rodriguez Valdez, a distant cousin in Phoenix, described how a mysterious woman had appeared at his father's auto repair shop in 1971, warning him about a business deal that would have bankrupted the family if they had proceeded with it. As these stories emerged, Daniel began to understand that Elena's letter to him was just one part of a much larger pattern of protection and guidance that she had provided to their extended family for decades. She had used her impossible gift, not for personal gain, but to ensure that the values and connections that bound their family together would survive across generations. On the first anniversary of receiving Elena's letter, Daniel made a pilgrimage back to the abandoned house with blue shutters. He had purchased the property and was slowly restoring it, planning to turn it into a family museum and retreat center where relatives could come to learn about their shared heritage. As he worked in Elena's former garden, planting vegetables and flowers, Daniel found himself thinking about the nature of time and how the past, present, and future seemed to weave together in ways that defied rational explanation. Elena had somehow reached across nearly 3 decades to deliver exactly the information he needed at exactly the moment when he was ready to receive it. But perhaps most remarkably, Daniel was beginning to experience hints of Elena's gift himself. Several times over the past year, he had found himself knowing things he shouldn't have been able to know, which neighbors were facing financial difficulties, which young people in the community needed guidance, which local issues required attention before they became crises. At first, Daniel had dismissed these insights as coincidence or good intuition, but as they continued to occur with increasing frequency and accuracy, he began to wonder if Elena's gift might be hereditary, passed down through the Valdez bloodline to emerge when it was most needed. The realization both thrilled and sobered him. If he truly possessed some version of Elena's abilities, then he had a responsibility to use them wisely, just as she had done. The gift was not about predicting the future for personal advantage, but about serving as a guardian and guide for the people and places he loved. Daniel had also discovered that the Whitmore family's connection to his own extended beyond the original land grant. Jonathan Whitmore's descendants had established their own foundation, dedicated to supporting rural communities in the American Southwest, and they had been quietly funding projects in northern New Mexico for decades without seeking recognition or credit. When Daniel contacted the Whitmore Foundation to share his family's story, he learned that Jonathan Whitmore had left detailed instructions for his heirs, expressing his hope that the two families would someday reconnect and work together to support the communities that had shaped both their histories. This reconnection led to a remarkable collaboration. The Rodriguez Valdez Foundation and the Whitmore Foundation began working together on ambitious projects to preserve the cultural and environmental heritage of the Southwest, combining resources and expertise to achieve far more than either could accomplish alone. But for Daniel, the most meaningful aspect of his transformed life was the simple knowledge that he was part of something larger than himself. A family story that spanned generations and transcended the normal boundaries of time and space. On quiet evenings, as he sat on his porch watching the sun set over the land his grandfather had received as a gift for showing kindness to a stranger, Daniel often thought about Elena Valdez and her impossible letter. He had never learned how she had acquired her gift of seeing, or exactly how she had managed to deliver a message across 27 years of time. But he had come to understand that some mysteries were more important for their meaning than their explanation. Elena's letter had taught him that the past was not a closed book, but a living presence that continued to shape the present and future. The kindness his grandfather had shown to a stranger in 1923 had rippled forward through time, creating opportunities and connections that Daniel was still discovering. Most importantly, Elena had shown him that true wealth lay not in possessions or even money, but in the relationships we build and the legacy we leave for future generations. The land, the trust fund, and the family connections were all gifts, but they were gifts that came with the responsibility to pass them forward, improved and enhanced, to those who would come after. As Daniel prepared for bed on this anniversary evening, he found a new letter waiting on his kitchen table, not impossible mail from the past, but a simple note from his neighbor's granddaughter, thanking him for the scholarship that would allow her to attend college and study environmental science. She wrote about her dreams of returning to the community to help preserve the land and traditions that had shaped her childhood. Reading her letter, Daniel smiled with the knowledge that Elena's legacy was continuing through him. Acts of kindness, once begun, had no ending. They simply multiplied and transformed, creating new stories of hope and connection with each passing generation. The rancher, who had received an impossible letter from 1955, had learned that some promises truly do transcend time, and that the greatest mysteries of life are not meant to be solved, but to be lived and shared with others who need to believe in the possibility of miracles. This incredible true story shows us that sometimes the past reaches out to guide us exactly when we need it most. Daniel's impossible letter